Okay, here we go with class number 8 of ethics and law. Uh, I wanted this to start this video session by summarizing a few things from the reading for last session. Now, when we met for last class, it was actually 3 chapters that were being covered. Assessment. The one we went through a good deal was research and publication, then assessment, and then therapy was actually the 3rd chapter. We didn't go through much of what was in the therapy chapter because we um, we had gone through it in different other sections, informed consent, dual relationships, sexual relationships with former clients. We had touched on all those things in previous classes, but I wanted here to um, to sort of start with a summary of some of the things that were covered in that chapter because chapter 10 is probably the one that will apply the most to things that you all do. And because it is so important, we actually didn't cover section 10 that much last class because we'd covered it throughout the course, because everything sort of comes back, all the ethical principles that we talked about before came down to the question of, well, how does this apply in a therapy context? Because in a clinical psychology PhD program, most people are going to wonder about the therapy situation. So, having said that, though, I wanted to just sort of go over the main points from standard 10. One, so as to make sure we actually have covered everything, but also because it segues the readings for the last 2 classes, including this one, or I'm sorry, the last 3 classes, including this one, talk more about the direct application of um, the ethical principles to different types of situations. So we will talk about uh, we will talk about applying it to managed care, applying it to supervision, applying it to an ethics complaint, and sort of the first chapter that we'll go through for this week has to do with um, sort of the process for making ethical decisions. Uh, so you want to have a real firm grip on the ethical principles that will apply the most to what you do. And since for many of you, for all of you, therapy will probably make up a major part of why you would use the ethical principles. I wanted to go through each of the sections from the standard 10, which has to do with therapy, just to make sure we've covered everything. So, section, for instance, the first part is informed consent. Um, uh, Informed consent. Now, we've gone through all this, but um, one thing we didn't go through in as much detail previously has to do with informed consent as it applies to clinical supervision. And the bottom line of this is if you are supervising a trainee who is seeing a therapy client, you have to basically make sure that it is in the informed consent section, that the person is being supervised and that you are the supervisor and that you are the person ultimately responsible for the therapy and what happens in the therapy. So that's an important aspect of something to have informed consent. The rest of that section on informed consent we've gone through. You know, you have to outline all the different things that apply. Uh, you have to make sure that you have spelled out um, that you have spelled out how the financial part of it will work, what sort of information can be disclosed, and what the person can expect in therapy. The second section uh, has to do was one we hadn't talked that much about, so I wanted to spend a minute talking about it here, which has to do therapy involving couples or families. And basically, um, it is important to realize that when you're working with families, whether families means you're working with the couple or family means that you're working with the parents and the children, you have to make sure at the beginning that you spell out what your relationship is going to be with each individual. I will give you some examples from situations where I've worked with couples and families. Two issues have come up. Um, One has been as it relates to when people use insurance. Because what happens with insurance, if you are doing couples therapy or if you are doing family therapy, um, uh, you still have to have someone identified as the patient. So, for instance, in couples, one one member of the couple will be using the insurance, and that person will be identified as um, the patient. So you'll have to make sure the couple understands that you will need to get more information about that one person because that is basically when you're billing insurance for couples therapy, you're basically telling the insurance company this individual has this condition, and the best way to treat that condition is to work on their marriage or their relationship. So that's why marital therapy or couples therapy is what I am going to provide. But you still have to make clear to the couple that someone is identified as the patient and they will stand out as the one who you need to get more information. Now, short of that, I will make clear to them that each member of the couple um, is treated the same, even to the point. And this comes up with the second issue that I need to make sure uh, couples understand is that I will not talk to one about the that if I'm doing couples therapy, I will not talk to one separately unless the other person knows that we're meeting and has a general idea why we're meeting. Um, and I make sure they understand that up front, that I'm not going to talk basically behind the other partner's uh, uh, back, because that would only hurt the therapy if the other partner were to find out. Side note, by the way, I don't know if I've brought this up before, so it's just an interesting point to keep in mind. Um, I if I am seeing, let's say, a college kid for therapy, sometimes the parent will call me up and say, "Hey, can I tell you about my son? Um, but I don't want you to tell him I called." Um, I will. Uh, uh, First off, I can't talk to the parent. You know, if the college kid is over 18, I can't talk to the parent without that kid's without the client's permission, as we already know. But the other thing is, even if for some reason I will have the client's permission to talk to the parent, I will not agree with the parent that I won't tell the client that the parent called. Basically, I won't talk to someone about my client, even if I have my client's permission to talk to the person, without my client knowing that I talked to them. Um, Ethically, I don't see there's no problem with that because I'm not refusing to get the information from them. I'm just not willing to keep it secret that I talked to the person. And to me, um, um, that just has such both of those things, talking to a partner in couples therapy behind the other partner's back, or talking to someone about your client without your client knowing it, can have just such a detrimental effect on the therapy if the client finds out that I won't do it. So bottom line is, ethically, I will not talk to one person about my client without my client knowing that I talked to them. Now, when it comes to being the identified patient, that's usually just an issue um, with um, with couples therapy. With family therapy, it's almost always the kid that is the identified client, and you're providing family therapy. Group therapy presents an interesting issue when it comes to um, group therapy presents um, interesting ethical dilemmas, or can, because when you're dealing with group therapy, you are dealing with other individuals who will hear what's going on, but are not bound by ethical principles of confidentiality like you are. So you may set a rule in the therapy that nobody's allowed to talk about what goes on in therapy outside of the therapy session, that you're not allowed to talk about members, but then you can't stop them when they leave doing what they want to do, even if they've agreed not to share. So you basically can't stop them from sharing if that's what they want to do. You can really stress that telling others is not acceptable. You can even say, if I find out that you have been sharing information about other members of this group with other people, um, you will no longer be in the group. But short of that, you can't actually stop them from sharing information. So you have to make that clear to other people in the group therapy session. You have to make sure that other people recognize that. And then the rest of chapter 10 is they basically comes down to two different things. One is sexual relationships with, they've got sexual relationships with clients, sexual relationships with family members of clients, and then the reverse, therapy with former sexual partners. Um, and so you can, it just basically is, you try, that you're not supposed to get into any sort of situation like that. And then the other sort of general principle that's covered under section 10 has to do with termination. And the bottom line of termination is, and we'll talk more about this later on, but the general principle with termination is, um, you terminate with the client when you feel you're no longer helping them. And on the flip side of that, you do not terminate therapy for reasons other than you think the therapy can no longer be effective. So you don't terminate therapy just because you've decided that you don't like the person, um, or uh, or they owe you money. I'll get to that one. Or you have um, another client who could fit better in their slot. Maybe would pay more or has better that's really where I'm going with that. So, you don't terminate for things like, well, this client has 5 o'clock and I've got someone with better insurance who would want the 5 o'clock slot. You don't terminate for things like that. Now, as far as terminating because um, they owe you money, keep in mind terminating is different than referring out. So you may not terminate, just cut off therapy with the individual and say, okay, we're done. But you may talk to them about how you can't schedule another appointment with them until they've paid their bill. And then you work with them about finding somewhere else to go. So terminate means you just cut things off. We're done, and that's the only reasonable way to do it. The only acceptable way to do that is if you think that therapy's gone as far as it's going to go. Now, it's interesting when you think about that when it comes to termination, that you could make the argument that if you don't particularly like a client, if you feel like um, that you and this client are not connecting, um, then it probably is also the case that you're not going to be effective with them. So that's an argument that could be made, you know. But even in that case, if you don't feel the person has um, accomplished all their goals, you wouldn't terminate them, you would refer them. So, like I said, there's, I guess it really comes down to there being a difference between termination and referring. By termination, I mean that you're wrapping things up and you're saying the therapy is done. And referral means you have more work to do, but I'm not the person who's really going to be able to help you with that. Okay, and that has to do with therapy. I just wanted to make sure to sort of pick up some loose ends there, uh, because we've talked about therapy throughout the course, ethics as it applies to therapy, and this relates to some parts of that that we haven't really talked that much about. Okay, I'm going to go back to the book now. That we've got the so uh, well, you say it, the process model for making an ethical decision. So this is sort of a summation of steps you would want to take to help you make a decision about what to do in an ethical quandary. Now, we talked earlier um, about some different approaches for that, and some different ways to make ethical decisions. And this is sort of taking some of that material we talked about earlier in the class and sort of wrapping it up in some very specific steps that you want to take uh, when you're making an ethical decision. So we've kind of gone from the more general ideas that we talked about at the beginning of the course, and now we're moving into some specific steps. Now, you have the book. I know you know each of the steps, but I want to talk a little bit more detail about each one of them. First one is uh, define the situation. Um, what was the word? Define the situation clearly. And um, so when you are facing a situation, it's interesting to think about that first step because, and it's also interesting to see, to think about in the context of how this section compares to some of the uh, things we were talking about at the beginning about, um, deciding if there's an ethical quandary and then determining what to do about it. Because what is interesting about these sets of steps, which I see as being more specific, more concrete than some of the steps we talked about at the beginning. What's interesting about this first step is it may seem obvious, define the situation clearly, but it's useful to keep in mind that most of the time when psychologists find an ethical dilemma, they will describe it as initially as it just didn't feel right. So it's, we've talked about each of these ethical standards, but it does hit me that sometimes it can sound like it's always going to be clear cut. Like this is, you know, standard 4.02, you know, bam. Um, but that's not how most psychologists would describe an ethical quandary. It would be something doesn't feel right. Um, and so the first thing you need to do is be very clear about what is the situation and what specifically do I think is wrong here. I know something doesn't seem right, but what exactly? So basically, you need to start by spelling it out, by spelling out um, what is the situation, what is actually going on that I'm concerned about. Um, so that's step one. You need to define the situation because chances are, if you find yourself in an ethical quandary, you will start by having the impression that something just doesn't seem right. Um, but it won't necessarily be the case that it'll initiate you as to what exactly doesn't feel right. Um, Second part, determine who will be impacted. Um, so what this means is not only who are you concerned about in the like as far as your client. I mean, chances are that if you're worried that someone's going to be impacted, your first thought will be your client, who is going to be impacted. But you also want to give thought to who else is likely to be impacted. Um, Again, we've talked a lot in here. I've talked about several times how reporting guidelines cause many psychologists concern to a certain degree because there is this idea that if you have to report a client for every bad decision they make as far as maybe becoming aggressive towards their children, if you feel a need to report that, you are hurting the chance that the client you're working with is going to continue is going to continue with therapy because they may just say, well, the heck with you. If you're going to keep reporting me to the authorities, the child care authorities, I'm going to stop therapy. So in that case, you then have taken away any likelihood that your client is going to continue to try to improve. Uh, but then you also are running the risk that if you don't report it, you're hurting those same children because it may be the case that your client is going to continue with therapy, but still continue to be aggressive towards the children. So there's that fine line about the children uh, being potentially hurt, regardless of what the decision is that you make. But you need to have an idea, not only very specific of the situation, but also you need to be clear to yourself about who is being impacted by the decision that you make, or who may be impacted um, by the decision you make. Now it's interesting. 3 and 4 are kind of interesting because notice um, the first step that's recommended is uh, refer to your ethical principles and standards. But notice then the fourth one is refer to the law. So the recommendation in this APA book is that the first place you go is the APA ethical standards, and then you go to the law, including the licensing law as it applies in your state. Now, there's a couple reasons for that, why one would come first. One is, I've talked to you about this a number of times already, that most states for their psychology licensing law defer to the APA ethical code anyway. Like, basically, the law says, in not so many words, um, psychologists are required to follow the APA ethics rules for their profession. So if you go to the ethical principles, um, you are um, already probably going to what the law is looking for anyway. But there's also this case too that you want to go to the ethical principles first because that's what psychologists have said about what you need to do. Laws and guidelines from professional boards, even professional standards in the licensing laws, aren't always written by psychologists. This entire book, everything we talked, and this is not the ethical guidelines. This is a sort of discussion of the ethical guidelines. If I had the ethical guidelines in front of me, I could do the same thing and say, this whole book was written by psychologists, lawyers as well, but lawyers who are also psychologists or lawyers who work with psychologists. So you go to the ethical principles first because that's the summary of what your profession says you're supposed to do. And it is the summary of guidelines written by others in your profession. So that's the first place to go. Um, because that's the that's basically um, what your profession is saying are the rules you need to follow. So you first need to go to the guidelines of your profession and say, am I doing what my profession tells me I'm supposed to do? And then what you do is go to the law to find out more specifically what the licensing law says in your state, because the law isn't going to replace, there's no law in the country that replaces an ethical guideline. What it From the APA, what it does, what they do sometimes is clarify or um, specify how that law is going to be, or how that ethical guideline is going to be applied in specific terms. So the ethical guideline, says that you look out for the welfare of your client, including your younger client. The law in your state says that if you are concerned about a younger client, this is who you call. And this is what you're allowed to do as far as making the report anonymous, um, making clear that you're not sure if this needed to be reported. So you erred on the side of caution. That's what the law says. It's a specification it's a clarity to how the ethical principle applies in your state. So the ethical principle gives you the general guideline, and then the legal statute talks about how that guideline is interpreted in your state. And like I said, there is no law that replaces the ethical guidelines, but they do clarify them and say, okay, in this state, this is what we have um, interpreted that ethical principle to mean. Um, Step 5, reflect honestly on personal feelings and competence. Okay, I mean, you want to take into account how you're feeling about it. Um, uh, but um, um, you want to reflect on how you feel about it, but you also want to reflect maybe even more formally on whether you have the competence to um, address the situation uh, effectively. So, you um, want to determine, you want to take time to determine if you are educated sufficiently and have sufficient experience in this area to uh, make a solid decision about um, what to do next. So if you are being asked by um, if you are being asked by um, a client to see that client's teenage child for depression or anxiety, and you've already gone through the ethical decision and determined that for whatever reason you have decided that it's ethical for you to see the person, the child, and that there's no law or professional standard saying you can't. You then have to ask yourself seriously, um, do I have um, the requisite experience to be able to work with the child? That's a little bit more clear cut. It's interesting that when we think about this stage, it's actually more, it can be a little bit more tricky to reflect on personal feelings. And you have to be pretty honest with yourself. And that may be not so obvious, but here's a dilemma, or here's an example. Let's say that we take that scenario I just gave you. You're working with a client, and for purpose of this discussion, you're the reason that you may be thinking that would be okay ethically for you to see this person's teenage son is because the therapy is over with the client. You've decided that the client reached all her goals. You help the client reach their goals. You're both in agreement. Goals have been reached. Therapy is done. So, and maybe part of what you were working on your client with is helping to decrease her level of emotional distress about problems that her teenage son is facing. So she then asks, could you see my son for therapy? Now, the first competence, and so maybe you've sort of passed through the ethical decision making there as far as ethical standards. Could you say, well, there's not a dual relationship because this person is no longer my client? Um, and then there's the competency question, and you may decide, well, I have experience. I don't specialize in working with teenagers, but I have experience working with teenagers. So I feel that I have the sufficient training and experience to work with this individual's teenage son. Fine. But when it comes to personal feelings, one of the more obvious ones that might come up is, um, you know, would there be any emotional issues being impacted by, um, my seeing this individual son, since I've already worked with this person's parent? And it might be like, let's say, for instance, let's say your client was very negative about her son. And so you would have to ask yourself, hey, do I have too much of a preconceived notion about her son to really help him? Have I just spent so much time hearing from this client how bad her son is that maybe I shouldn't see him because I've got this really bad preconceived notion? That's one obvious feeling that may be taken into account. But another one that may not be so obvious or not good for, or maybe not one that psychologists would even want to admit that they have, is the question you would need to ask yourself of, am I in too much of a hurry to take on this new client because I just lost the client and don't have anyone to replace her? In other words, it's an issue that it can be unpleasant for psychologists to think might even impact them, but it does impact everybody. It would impact everybody. When you lose one client, you have to ask yourself in this sort of situation, basically, would my decision be different if my caseload was fuller? If I was if I'm being asked to see this woman's teenage son, I have to ask myself and be honest, is my decision impacted by, um, my having less clients than I would like? Really, where competency becomes more of a dangerous issue for psychologists is basically when they're not busy, when they have a private practice, uh, where the referrals aren't coming in for whatever reason, or if they work for an agency or work for a group practice that requires they see, 25 clients a week and they've only got 18. So it's that sort of situation that can put psychologists in the most dangerous spot for maybe overstepping their competence. I've never worked with a teenage kid, but now I've got a parent asking me if I can see her teenage kid. How much different could it be? And I need the referrals anyway. So that's really where this issue of personal feelings come in, is how much are you basing your decision on being concerned that you may just not have enough clients, um, and need more referrals. So that's a legitimate. I'm not bad mouthing or criticizing psychologists at all for having that thought, that concern. I think it's a legitimate one. You just have to be honest with it. So that's an example of an honest feeling that this step five refers to, that may not always jump out at you as far as something to be concerned, but it's a real concern. How much are you allowing your caseload to impact your decision making in that process. Um, uh, the uh, the beginning of this chapter makes note of this, and I wanted to okay, notice that 6 and 9 uh, both mention consulting with trusted colleagues. Um, they mention at the beginning of the chapter, but I think it's worth reiterating that it's by design that they mention consulting with colleagues twice, um, because it can be such an important step. Making it clear that you have sought out advice from others in your profession who could give you a clean view of things, and sort of see things from an objective perspective. But notice how it mentions the steps here mention talking with colleagues before you formulate a plan of action, and then talking about uh, uh, talking about consulting with trusted colleagues after you've developed a plan, but before you put the plan into action. So it's useful to keep in mind how important consulting with trusted colleagues is seen when it comes to ethical decision making. Bringing other people in to give you advice, give you their thoughts about things. So, you'd want to just ask them, hey, this is what I'm facing. This is what I'm thinking. This is what sort of ethical issues I think apply. What do you think? And get their feedback on it. All of that is very important. Like I said, it's useful to keep in mind that consulting with colleagues is mentioned twice in this whole process. Next one, formulate a course of action. Figure out once you have once you have been very definitive about what sort of situation you're facing, who all is involved, and who's likely to be impacted by any decision you make. Um, what sort of um, what sort of personal feelings and competency issues might enter into it, but also what are the specific ethical issues involved, and what are some other legal statutes or licensing rules that might apply. So once you take all of that into account, you then have to give serious thought to what are my different potential courses of action. Um, what what could I be doing here? And then I was going to add this 7 and 8 kind of go together, because what you 7 8 is formulate the plan, but then once you develop a plan, then your next step would be to figure out what the possible outcomes might be. So you want to sit down once you've talked with colleagues, once you've gotten a full picture of what's going on and what you're facing, you then need to formulate a plan, formulate what your courses of action might be, and then figure out um, what the different alternative outcomes might be. So, this is what I could do, and this is what's likely to come about as a result of me doing that. And then, it becomes very specific. I mean, you sit there and you figure out what is it that I could do, and then what are the possible outcomes. And then notice it then goes into step 9, which is then you take it back to trusted colleagues. And they mention what's the other word? Ethics committees. So notice one difference between, I think it was between step 6, where we first mentioned consulting with trusted colleagues, and step 9 is now it's not only going back to the colleagues you already spoke to see what they think about what decision you made, but it's also then bringing in ethics committees. And ethics committees could be um, your state psychological association and their ethics committee. I mentioned in here several times that I belong to the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, and we have an individual there uh, whose primary job with the organization, he's an employee, and his job is to present um, ethical advice. Um, so he now some state psychological associations might have something that's called a, uh, maybe an ethics committee, where different psychologists will review situations presented by members and provide some sort of guidance. Um, but so it's again this idea of consulting with other people, uh, whether it means going back to the, well, no, it would mean both, going back to the people who helped you initially sort of think through these this scenario, and also going to more formally the ethics committee or the ethics consultant associated with your state psycho or your regional psychological association. I've mentioned this here before as well, that another option is not necessarily an ethics committee, but the ethics hotline or the ethics um, consultant uh, who may work for your liability insurance carrier. So I have liability insurance, and there is a department I can call if I have ethical concerns or concerns about the legal aspects of um, of a patient issue or a possible ethical dilemma, and they can provide me guidance there. And then notice that step 10 is notice that step 10 isn't um, just, you would think step 10 might be just put the plan into action. I mean, you've figured out what the potential options are, you've consulted with colleagues, you thought through what the possible outcomes could be. You might think that 10 would just stand at, okay, put it into action and see what happens. But that's not exactly what 10 says. 10 says basically put it into action, but then monitor what's happening and revise it as needed. So decisions that you make, ethical decisions that you make, are not such that they're set in stone once you make them. There always is the possibility of you changing course if it doesn't look like this was the best decision. You're not, basically, all this is saying, and I think this is important to keep in mind, is you are not locked in once you make a decision. It's not like, okay, I rolled the dice and I just got to take the consequences. That may happen, but for the most part, you want to work under the assumption that if I monitor what's going on, then there will always be that potential that I could change course if it looks like that's necessary. if things don't look like they're going how I thought they would, and if it doesn't look like this is all going in a good direction, then there's always the possibility that I could modify things as I go along. So you always want to be prepared to see if something's going wrong and change course if it's needed. Okay, those are the 10 steps of working through an ethical dilemma. And they're all meant to help you understand some very specific steps for addressing things that come up um, based on the ethical principles that we've been talking about throughout this course. Uh, I'm not going to go too much into managed care right now. We can certainly pick that up at the live class. Managed care is the next section. Managed care, I'm actually, well, this book's several years old because I don't know, for some reason that term doesn't seem to be used as much. I mean, don't get me wrong, managed care still exists and exists very prominently, but it's almost like the difference, I think, between where things were when this book was written, which was more than 10 years ago, and now is managed care at the time was a type of insurance coverage that you could get. There were different plans, and one plan would be an would be a managed care program. Now, I think people almost, one of the reasons you don't hear the term managed care used as much is I think a lot of people equate managed care with insurance. Like anymore, like a couple of years ago when there was this big debate about Obamacare and whether to keep it or whatever, you heard the term uh, health insurance used a lot with no specific reference to managed care. Managed care plays a big role in Affordable Care Act plans, but it's almost like it's no longer talked about as managed care. It's just health insurance. This is just how managed care is a part of almost all health insurance plans now. There's some aspect of, you know, there being a department that's sort of keeping an eye on how much care is being used and what sort of approaches can be used to limit some of that care. So when you're dealing with managed care, it's a whole other entity. It's so when we talk about managed care, we're basically going to talk about how you deal with health insurance and what are some of the ethical things to keep in mind there, not only in terms of some major issues that we'll pick up when we talk about this in class are, you know, who can you release, what information can you release, because when you're dealing with the insurance company, you're by definition facing a situation where more people are going to know about what's going on with your client. So how much information can you release about the client, and also, keeping an eye to make sure that you are not overbilling, that you are not billing insurance for um, longer sessions than you need. You meet with the client for, you know, 20 minutes and you bill them for a 45-minute session. Making sure that you are not being inaccurate um, or fraudulent about what services you are providing. So those are two major ethical issues that come up when we talk about healthcare and managed care. But we'll talk about that in more detail at the live class. So I will see you all on Friday morning.